A concept that seems to be very frequently mentioned by the media when referring to the 2016 presidential election is that of a contested convention, otherwise known as a brokered convention in some circles. This has been primarily used when referring to the Republican side of the race, as it is almost a near certainty that it is going to occur on their side this summer. The Democratic side has also had it mentioned, but it is a much more slim possibility of its occurrence. But many people may be asking themselves, what exactly is this contested convention that pundits keep on going on and on and on about? Well, that's what I'm here for, to help explain it and help explain the significance of it if it does actually occur this year. So let's delve into some dry and dusty political information. So we're going to start off by defining what a contested convention really is. Essentially, in a standard election year, one candidate will typically win enough of the delegates allocated through their party's nominating process through primaries and caucuses to be able to clinch the, nomination. This amount that they need is typically what is known as a simple majority, or over 50% of the delegates available in the election cycle. However, in some years, including what looks to be this one, none of the candidates running for office garner enough of the delegates available to get that simple majority, and fall short of clinching that nomination. This essentially means that none of the candidates running qualify for the nomination outright. And this is where the convention part comes in. The conventions for each party are held after all the primaries and caucuses have all blown over, and are usually more of a procedural, celebratory event that praises the nominee and hypes up their chances for the general election in the fall. The event is typically more of a support candidate X, they're great sort of thing that goes on for an entire week. You would think they would run out of synonyms for how great somebody is after the latest at day 2, but I digress. To get down into the nitty-gritty of a typical election year's convention, besides all the lauding and bootlicking, the important piece that we're going to be focusing on is the role of the delegates. Delegates, those things you hear about candidates winning from each primary and caucus, are actually real people, not just a figure on a spreadsheet. These delegates, which are chosen throughout the nominating process and are quote-unquote bound to the candidate that won their particular primary or caucus, though there are unbound delegates and we'll get to that later, all attend their party's convention. They represent their state and the will of the voters in their states, typically. Many delegates who are chosen do support the candidate that they are inevitably bound to, but in some states, this isn't a requirement. Even if a delegate's candidate preference doesn't necessarily match to whom their state bound them to, they are obligated, for the most part, to vote for them in what is known as the first ballot. Essentially what the first ballot is when at the convention the delegates all vote for the candidate that they are bound to. If through the first ballot a candidate receives a simple majority of the vote over 50%, which in the Republicans' case is 1,237 delegates or more, they have won the nomination. But there's a caveat. If no candidate receives a majority, then none of the candidates running receive the nomination as of yet. What happens in the wake of what I'll refer to as a split vote is that after the first ballot, if no nominee is selected, then the vast majority of delegates become what is known as unbound. Now, there are some delegates, about 5% on the Republican side, that are unbound from the very start of proceedings, but after a failed first ballot, around 60% of the delegates become unbound. What this means is that they are now able to vote for whatever candidate they would like, regardless of who they were originally bound to by their state. And so we move on to the second ballot, or the second vote. If someone receives a majority vote within the second ballot, then they are the nominee, even if they did not initially come to the convention with the highest amount of delegates. If nobody wins a majority again, then it moves on to a third ballot, where even more of the delegates become unbound, around 80% on the Republican side. And this series of voting continues until a candidate actually receives a majority of the votes, no matter how many ballots it takes. There is a little bit of downtime in between each of these ballots for potential delegates or candidates or officials to try to sway the votes of those undecided or unbound delegates to their side, obviously to try to attempt to clinch the nomination as soon as possible within the voting process. And now here comes the fun part, to tie it back to the current political situation. Many analysts at this point are under the impression that Donald Trump, currently the Republican frontrunner, will not have the requisite amount of delegates to clinch the nomination at the Republican National Convention this year. And, to be quite honest, he's really the only candidate on the Republican side capable of getting the amount of delegates needed before the convention. The remaining candidates, namely Ted Cruz and John Kasich, would either have a nearly insurmountable task in order to clinch the nomination outright, or an outright impossible path, with Ted Cruz needing about 80% of the remaining delegates to get the number needed for the nomination, and John Kasich literally not being able to get it at all, even if he won 100% of what's to come. Trump stands the best chance, and even he needs about 60% of the delegates remaining, which still seems very unlikely. And now we come to the relevant part. What could the potential outcome of a contested Republican convention be? Well, the first outcome, although not the likeliest, is that Donald Trump goes into the convention just shy of the nomination and manages to sway enough of the delegates to his side for the second ballot in order to clinch the nomination. Or another option would be that he manages to convince the unbound delegates that are available for the first ballot over to his side and manages to just get the nomination outright at that point. But this, unfortunately for the Donald, is not the scenario that most are predicting will occur. The most likely way that a contested convention this summer would unfold is that most of Donald Trump's delegates would in a sense defect from him and go to other candidates such as Ted Cruz, John Kasich, or anybody else that offers themselves up for the nomination at that point. Cruz, who is the next closest to the nomination behind Trump, is a presumably likely choice for delegates, given that he'll have a lot of staying power due to his currently high amount of delegates. Kasich could also end up being an appealing choice for those who believe in his pragmatism, experience, perceived kindness, and so forth, and in addition to the fact that he's the only candidate on the Republican side currently polling ahead of both Clinton and Sanders in the general election in the fall. He could also end up being an appealing choice for so-called establishment Republicans who are currently in office, as many delegates end up being elected officials. One of the other possibilities as well is that of the convention choosing a candidate who hasn't even run this election cycle, and thus is where the rumors of Mitt Romney or a Paul Ryan candidacy arise, though both men have vehemently denied the fact that they are going to run. There's also some other factors that could come into play, such as dropped-out candidates like Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, Rand Paul throwing their hats back in the ring, or, in Rubio's case, brokering deals with current candidates for their delegates, in the sense that Rubio currently still holds on to around 170 delegates and could try to convince them to swing over to a particular candidate he endorses in the second ballot or third ballot. It's really difficult to predict the outcome of a contested convention, given that delegates are people. They're individuals who can make their own choices, and there's no real model to kind of predict which way they would end up going or what the candidates may do to get them onto their sides. But one thing is for certain, if there is a contested convention, it's going to be one heck of a spectacle. Now, there is the whole potential issue of what is known as faithless electors, or faithless delegates in this case, where a delegate will basically ignore the fact that they are pledged and vote for whatever candidate that they would like to, or not vote at all. But due to the fact that this would most likely just contribute to a contested convention, or essentially not be occurring in a high enough quantity to really affect things, I decided not to really bring it up in this case. I also know that there are plenty of other factors that could influence a contested convention, but I decided to just kind of lay the groundwork for you so that you would have basic knowledge of what a contested convention is and what could potentially happen. Of course, the process could go just as smoothly as any other election year, but hey, speculation is a blast. I hope this was enlightening for you, and may the odds ever be in your candidate's favor. This has been The Political Vampire. Thanks.